You know, when you think about it, it's kind of crazy. For a place that's not all that big, Greater Manchester has this incredibly dark and frankly disproportionate role in the history of true crime. So today, we're going to look at the stories of the serial killers who cast such a long shadow over this part of England.
But first, I have a question for you. And let's be honest with ourselves here. Why are we so completely obsessed with the darkest side of human nature? I mean, from old Victorian stories to the latest binge watch on Netflix, we just can't seem to get enough. What is that all about?
And look, this isn't just a hunch. The numbers are absolutely wild. Just one recent crime show pulled in over 12 million views in its first 3 days. So this isn't some niche hobby. It's a massive global fascination. It's like this strange mix of wanting to understand the why and, maybe learning how to protect ourselves that keeps us glued to the screen.
Okay, so before we really dive in, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. For this explainer, we're using the official definition. A serial killer is someone who murders 3 or more people and, this is the key part, has a cooling-off period in between. That's what separates them from spree killers or mass murderers.
Now this chart really puts it all into perspective. The good news is these kinds of killers are incredibly rare in the UK. This study, which looked at almost 200 years of data, found only 62 in total. But look at that second bar. A really significant chunk of them operated in Greater Manchester. So what on earth was going on there?
To find out, we have to go back, way back, to the 19th century. We're talking about a time of industrial grit, but also a time of easily available poisons, citywide panic, and newspapers that absolutely loved a sensational murder story.
And that's where we meet Marianne Britland. She was a factory worker who would become the first woman ever executed at Manchester's notorious Strangeways prison. Her crimes were just brutally calculated. First, she poisoned her own daughter, then her husband, all for a bit of insurance money. When the wife of the man she was having an affair with also died, well, people started to connect the dots.
And if you want to know just how cold she was, get a load of this. This is a quote from James Barry, the man whose job it was to execute her. He was a professional hangman who had seen it all, and he said she was the worst woman he ever dealt with. That says everything, doesn't it?
Now everybody knows the name Jack the Ripper. While London was terrified of him, Manchester was dealing with its very own version. But this story has an even more terrifying ending because this killer was never, ever caught.
And the pattern was just chillingly precise. The victims were always young boys, around 15 years old. They were lured into empty houses, strangled, and their mouths stuffed with paper. And then he left his calling card, a red handkerchief tied around their face. It was a horrifying signature meant to terrorize the entire city.
Okay, so let's jump forward now into the mid-20th century, because a new wave of killers was about to emerge, and their names would become infamous, not just in Manchester, but around the entire world.
You can see it right here on this timeline. After those Victorian cases, there was this long period of relative quiet, and then, bam, the 1960s hit, and it's like a switch was flipped. You get this sudden, terrifying cluster of cases, one after another. It was a new era of violence that would scar an entire generation.
Now, the names Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are pretty much synonymous with evil in the UK. Over a 2-year period, they abducted, tortured, and murdered 5 children and teenagers. But their true legacy, the thing that left a permanent scar on the nation, was what they did afterwards. They buried their victims in shallow graves on the bleak, desolate Saddleworth Moor.
And in a final, unbelievably cruel act, despite decades of searches and desperate pleas from his mother, the body of one of their victims, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, is still out there somewhere on that moor. They took that secret to their graves.
So next up is a killer whose sheer cunning was just as shocking as his violence. His name was Trevor Hardy, the so-called Beast of Manchester. He murdered 3 young women. At one point, his own brother turned him in to the police. But while he was in custody, Hardy did something unbelievable. He literally filed his own teeth into sharp points. Why? To make sure the bite mark evidence against him would be useless. And it worked. They had to let him go, and he went on to kill again. And the terror of the 70s just didn't let up. As if Hardy wasn't enough, the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, brought his own reign of terror to Manchester, committing 2 of his murders there. At the very same time, another killer called the Black Panther was robbing and murdering his way across the region. I mean, can you even imagine the fear people must have felt living there at that time? It would have been constant.
So let's move to our final case, and this
This one is arguably the most chilling of all, because this wasn't some monster lurking in the shadows. As the subtitle says, this was the killer you invited into your home. This was your friendly, local doctor, Harold Shipman.
Just take a second to look at that number. 215 plus. It's almost impossible to get your head around. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but a massive public inquiry later concluded he had likely killed over 215 of his patients. That makes him, by a huge margin, the most prolific serial killer in modern British history.
And his method was just so terrifyingly simple and systematic. Step 1, he'd visit one of his elderly patients at their home. Step 2, he'd give them a lethal injection of pure diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. And step 3, he'd just go back to his office, open their file on his computer, and invent a fake cause of death. As simple and as horrifying as that. So after going through all of that darkness, we have to ask, what's the legacy here? Why do we still remember these specific stories so vividly? Why do they continue to haunt us and, fascinate us all these decades later?
And really, that brings us right back to that first question I asked you. When we consume all this true crime content, are we genuinely trying to understand evil, to see the warning signs? Or are we just feeding our morbid curiosity, getting a thrill from staring into the abyss from a safe distance? It's a tough question, but I think it's one worth thinking about.